Hello and welcome to the Intentional Soul, the home for the highly functioning spiritual types out in the world. It is here that we look at the world and ourselves through the lens of higher consciousness, connecting deeply to who and what we really are. Now, my name is Tom Ross, spiritual teacher, healer, spiritual nonconformist, and I am your host for these conversations. On the Intentional Soul, we hear not only from me, but from people who are living intentionally, openly, and authentically in their world. We'll hear their stories of personal transformation while sharing best practices and tactics to help you get the most out of this game called life. Now, nothing is off limits as we seek to expand ourselves and our awareness and live, ultimately, our most authentic lives. Let's dive in. All right, welcome, Miss Amira Martin, to the Intentional Soul podcast. Now, Amira is a communication expert and actually a psychotherapist and wellness professional. Moreover, she's the owner of Amira for Her, a group private practice. Amira, I believe you're also an adjunct lecturer at Columbia University School of Social Work. Is that correct?
Yes, I am. It's been terrific. Yep.
Now, you're dedicated to creating safe and supportive therapy spaces. And I just thought that was a fascinating line in your biography. Would you mind, before we kind of dive into you, can you tell me, what is safe and supportive therapy spaces in practice?
Yeah. So really it means a couple things, right? Like a lot of people go into therapy, and when people go into therapy, they don't always feel safe. Sometimes it can feel like a place of judgment. Sometimes it can feel like a place of criticism. Sometimes it can feel like a place where they experience all the isms, right? Like racism, sexism, all sorts of stuff. So safe and supportive therapy space is really about just that, right? Like I want the therapy spaces that people come into to feel safe for them, whoever they are, whatever it is that they're bringing to the table and struggling with. And also supportive, right? So we don't do like some of the stuff that some psychotherapists will do where the person is kind of put on this platform and kind of poked until they get at what the issue is. We do therapy in a way that's supportive and that, people can walk away feeling intact each session.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to have 1,000 questions for you about that as we move on. However, before we dive into it, would you mind kind of telling us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure, absolutely. So I am a New York City native, right? How far do you want me to go back, Thomas?
Let's say what brought you to you dealt with trauma in the past, and that's something that you've been pretty open about in terms of sharing your story. And this podcast is really about intentional transformation, and working through, and that resonated very powerfully for me when I read your story. So you can go as far back as you'd like to go, but we just really want to hear your story. What's brought you to the place that you are right now?
Yeah, so I'll mention a couple of things that I think are really key to where I am right now, right? The first one is having grown up in the Bronx, New York City, being raised by a single mom. My mom left my father when I was about 4 or 5 and, raised my 7 siblings on her own. And myself, well, I make 7, right? Like with all of us, it's 7. And my dad was abusive. And not only was he abusive, but he was also mentally ill and addicted, right? So there was some early trauma just with those experiences, kind of like the seeds of trauma were set. So I grow up and, have all the sorts of regular challenges that people living in urban environments have, right? Like that people of color have, that women have, that any group that's marginalized and oppressed has, right? And I wanted to go into something that had meaning to me. I was a mom really young, and that made me want to have a really good career because I had this beautiful child that I wanted to take really good care of. So I ended up getting my MSW, becoming a therapist, really. And actually, at first I worked in administration, great career going. And I met someone who I thought was the love of my life, right? And I was a full grown woman, 36 years old, had this whole career, had a home, had a nice savings account, had just made director with, a really large nonprofit organization. It's really prestigious.
Stable. Like you were a stable,
professional
woman. Perfect.
Super stable, super stable. And so I decided to have a party because here I had made director and I was super happy. So I have this party and I need a caterer at the last minute. So somebody from one of my middle school Facebook group replies and is a caterer. Long story short, I end up seeing him. We get involved, fall in love, have like this amazing courtship experience of like literally holding hands, skipping through the city. And I end up being like horrifically abused, right? So coming out of that, what I thought was like my dream relationship ended up being me being the victim of antisocial personality disorder abuse. And I'm a therapist, right? So like there's a lot of shame and I should have known better, but I didn't for lots of reasons. And that's where I am. That's why safe and supportive therapy spaces are important to me at this point.
That's amazing. So, will you kind of talk just as a throwaway comment, but I think it's just so important, just the shame and self-judgment that people often apply to themselves when they make the mistake of being a human being, even though they're in a field that they should seem to know better. Like how did you move through that process personally?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, it was a couple of things. One, the shame came from that I let this happen again, meaning generational cycles, right? Like it's been a big part of my existence to break generational, the Black community, we call them generational curses, right? So like to make the changes that could have helped my parents and their parents and their parents, for those to stop in me and for me to make a change with my children in my life, right? So I repeated that. I was abused and I chose a husband who abused me. So that in itself was like just this huge letdown. Like here I am, this like person who can do so much and so capable and smart and able-bodied, but I couldn't even choose somebody who wouldn't beat me and be like not a pathological person, So that was shame. Then there's the fact that I worked in organizations and with people around helping women, right? Like, how did I not know these things? How did I not pick up on these signs? So I really had to dive in deep and had to dive into research and I had to dive into learning more about the specifics about what happened. Why didn't I recognize it? What was happening? And what I learned was that the person that I was with was suffering from, may have been diagnosed, I don't know, but from all of the different types of abuse and the different types of crimes that this person committed, that I learned about later, antisocial personality disorder, right? Which really speaks to a very specific type of abuse. And it's not what you normally see with like typical domestic violence. So one is, for me, learning about that was incredibly healing, right? So there were reasons I missed the signs because they weren't the typical signs. And there were reasons that I wanted to, after the first time he hit me, I wanted to start therapy with him. I helped him to get into see a psychiatrist and start treatment for himself. Like I still had the belief that this could work. And there were things about me and my character traits, which were things that he tapped into in order to get what he wanted in the long run. So learning those things was incredibly helpful and also really just powerful and empowering for me.
Awesome. So then if I'm hearing, was the process of forgiveness, for you, like you've forgiven yourself for allowing to be in the position, was part of that process, just like the understanding that, oh, here are the reasons why that I didn't. It doesn't feel like that's probably the whole thing, but like it seemed like you just mentioned that it was certainly key to understanding the why that this thing happened to you. What was the other component to you being able to heal from having this occur?
Yeah. So understanding why it happened, right? Like who I am and like what are those traits that made me like the perfect victim, so to speak, right? And understanding that what he was dealing with and what he, it's not something that I was trained to see, was not something that I was taught to understand and not something that we talk about just day to day. So that helped. And then also just accepting that, you know what, I'm not the first person, male or female, who's been abused in this way. I'm not the first person who has experienced, heartbreak and trauma at the hands of someone they once loved. Those are the things that have helped me to forgive myself, which, really took work.
Yeah, it's amazing. And so now all of that, and in this place, Amira, for her, creating, safe and supportive therapy spaces. Would you mind just like diving in to, and again, you say it so quickly, and yet like there's so much there. At the very end of when you were talking about it, you said, we do things that aren't typical. Would you dive into that like a little bit more? Like, what do you do to create these spaces, which apparently are not the norm in the industry?
Yeah, so I hate to say it because I think that like some of what we're trained to do is useful, but I don't think it's useful for everyone. I think it's not useful for a lot of people. And I think it goes well beyond like race, gender, sexual identity, all that sort of stuff. I think, one of the things that we do is we really work in a way where we're connecting with the person where they are, and we're not using jargon. We're not communicating with them in the way where we're the experts sitting back and, having them share their story while we give minimal feedback, right? Like we engage people, we have rich discussions, we share portions of who we are and ourselves and our lives. Like obviously the session's not going to become about us as a therapist, but we're okay with sharing some pieces of that, right? Like we don't have the whole, the complete, we don't offer that experience where you don't show who you are or share anything about your personal life or your experiences. We do just the opposite. We are intentionally going to share the things that help our clients to connect with us and understand that we can understand them and help them.
Got it. Okay. Because it's like literally meeting them as a human being instead of, all right, unwrap me, shrink, like just that kind of, that kind of like do me, I'm on the couch, figure it out. Right. Okay. I got you. Right. So is this something that you envisioned when you first got into your career in social work and psychotherapy, or is this different than what you had imagined it would be?
It's very different than what I had imagined. And it was actually in part, obviously like my early experiences were part of me wanting to do this and like to help people and to connect and all that stuff. But I think I was about 22. I was in therapy. I was in undergrad. I hadn't even started grad school yet. And I had this therapist, this woman at a local hospital, and I would meet with her. And I literally felt almost like viewed as like, I don't even know what, but just not a person in session with her. And it was clear that she wasn't really comfortable with me. And, that could have been about a million different things, right? Like, I don't really know exactly what that was about. It could have been about anything, but it wasn't okay. And so then I went to graduate school. I stopped seeing her after, 6 months or so. It just didn't take off. So I went to grad school and, I found another therapist, but I went to grad school, finished grad school, and a couple of years out, I started working at a mental health clinic in Westchester. And when I'm at this clinic, there she is, my therapist, who wasn't super helpful. And the interactions that we had, even as colleagues now, were like just as awkward, just as strange. She would, run, get up and run off, in meetings the same way she did in our sessions. So I realized that it was really more of a her problem than anything, right? But this told me, like, Amira, when you feel ready to become a therapist, because I knew I needed to take time with that, right? When you are ready, you are going to connect with people as humans. Like, that was the first thing, right? Like, and then obviously, like, I had lots of other experiences where things that were just like not comfortable, where people didn't feel comfortable connecting for who knows how many other reasons. But, it was an experience over time of having those sorts of negative experiences with therapy.
And so that informed this different perspective that that you have in the market. Probably not the only person that has a perspective, however, compared to the market entirely. So how conscious are you as you take on a new client of that intangible connective component, right? So you are keenly aware that it wasn't working between you and your therapist, and is that something that you and people that work with you within the group that you're keenly aware of like, if this doesn't feel a particular way, then let's find them someone like who it does. Because I would suspect that that's not entirely common for the industry if a customer shows up in the door, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, that's very important to us. Very important to us. And we do it in a couple of ways. We do it through our consultation with them when we have that initial consultation where it's, screening for fit with us as a therapist who might be providing services. And then also when we're meeting with them, if it's not working, that's something that's brought into supervision. That's something that people think about and talk about. How does this feel? And do you feel like it's working? And I hate to say this, but this is important, right? Like, do you like the person you're helping? Do you like this client? Do you feel like you can help this client? If you don't like them, and if you don't feel like it's working, if either of those are the case, then we need to figure out something else. If you don't like them, there's no way around that. They have to be transferred either to another clinician or to outside or whatever it is. We don't try to help people that we don't like because we end up doing more harm than good. That's just a reality in this field. Like, you will do more harm than good if you don't like and you're not comfortable with your client. And then the other part of like, are you helping them, right? Like, that's key too. If you're 6 months in, have you made some progress? And if you haven't made some progress, if you haven't helped them to get closer to their goal, then you need to rethink this, and what do you need to do differently to make this work, to help them to make this work? Or do you need to revisit whether or not you're the right the right person to see them? So it could be either, but we are really serious about those things, because it's important that it works and that it feels like it's working for everyone in order for this to actually be beneficial,
It's so good. And it's just something that doesn't exist broadly in certainly larger practices. I think it's maybe a little bit more common in unique practitioners. And whenever I'm potentially taking somebody on as a healing client, like it's like, can I help this person is the first the first component to it. Doesn't really matter. No other questions are relevant, really after that. If we don't kind of get there. And do you feel that in your experience with all the people that you've seen and work for, do you feel that there's a component of healing, which is like the volition of the individual, or a desire to, for them to heal? And then is that part of the arithmetic, like that you're looking at? Like, do you ever try to get somebody to want to heal themselves, or do they only ever get to you when they're already in a position where they want to heal? Or have you had to say, hey, this isn't going to work because you're not ready? Like, what does that look like for you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's funny that you asked that, because just yesterday I had one of the clinicians call me and she's like, Amira, I don't feel like this person is ready for therapy. Like, this person will not dive deep at all in any way, shape, or form, and won't even share what they've experienced at all. So there's nowhere to go with this. But absolutely, I think we can't do this unless the person wants to heal and wants to grow, right? Like, there's nothing that we can do to make that happen. But being in private practice, having a large group practice, we're usually getting people who do want to heal and want to grow. Like, they're coming at their own free will. Sometimes we might get a couple where one of the parties of the couple is dragged into therapy, right? And like, oh, let's help us make this work. And it's evident that one person, either they don't want it to work, or they're not willing to do any work to make it work, or they don't want to be bothered with therapy at all. So that's where we usually encounter people who don't want to be bothered, or don't feel like they have the will or the ability or the interest to heal. But we're in a lucky place where most of the people come to us do want to and are willing to.
Yeah, it makes sense. Dragging the spouse in, figuring it out. I mean, it's a recipe for probably a lot of that. How do you navigate those waters? Like, when it's somebody and it's a marital or something in that realm, and you do have one party that's totally dug in and not interested, and you have another party that's in this place of like yearning, searching, and wanting something different.
Yeah. So with something like that, well, first, we do like an individual meeting with each party, so we get a good sense of where they are with that. If it seems like it's still a possibility in some way, we'll have a session or two with them as a couple, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about like, how ready are you to make some changes? How ready are you to dive in deep with this? How ready are you to listen to what your partner has to say and give some feedback about how you're feeling, what your experiences have been, and what your needs are. And we'll ask direct questions about those things. And I think sometimes that can help us to move someone who's not ready at all to like being ready or starting to be ready, is hearing that we care about you also and what your needs are in this relationship. Because a lot of times people feel like, well, you're just going to side with him because whatever. You're just going to side with her because whatever. You're going to just side with them because whatever. So we're really, we're really thoughtful about making sure that every voice is pulled in and that they know that we're paying attention to their needs too.
Let's say if there was somebody listening that was in a situation where there is marital counseling or some counseling in that ilk that was needed or wanted. How, and it is this kind of like, it's not a two-party system, it's the one party pulling the other one in. Are there like three things that you could think of off the top of your head that you could advise somebody, hey, when you're engaging in this or when you're going to start this process, here are a few things to consider, or what you want to ask of of the therapist that you're considering? Like, what would that be if you're going to throw a few tips at somebody?
Yeah. So is this somebody who is coming to therapy and they're dragging their partner with them?
I would say, well, you can run it either way. That's the scenario that I was thinking. I.e., you have one party who is, let's use a term, more conscious than the other party, who's stuck in a more positioned righteousness, victim, or what have you. And you have one party that's in there pulling that other energy into the situation for the sake of attempting to salvage or grow in a particular direction. However, if you want to hit the other side also, by all means, it's your show.
Okay, terrific. So in terms of the party who's doing the dragging, right, the first thing that I'll ask them, that I'll tell them that they should think about is, what is it that they want to get out of dragging this person in? What is it that they want to get out of couples therapy? And does it seem at all feasible, right? Like, that's the second thing. Like, is your partner someone who's saying, I'll go to the session because you want me to, but I'm not saying a word? Or is your partner someone who's saying, well, I'll try, or I'm not comfortable, but I'll give it a shot today, or I'll listen today. And, maybe next session I'll say something if I feel comfortable, right? Like, how much of a no-go is this, right? So what do you want to get out of it? And is this feasible? Those are two questions that I can think of for the person who's doing the dragging. The questions I can think of for the person who's being dragged in, right? Like, I would ask them, do you have particular needs that aren't being met in this relationship? Are there particular things that you want in this relationship to go differently in order for you to feel more satisfied? Are you comfortable, or do you think you'll be able to become comfortable after we get to know you a bit, or after a therapist gets to know you a bit, to be able to share your side of things? So those can be some things that help them to think through, like, can this actually be beneficial? And maybe it can, or maybe it can't. Maybe there's nothing you can do that can help me. I don't care what you have to say. You therapists are all quacks and I'd never talk to you anyway, right? But like, those are some of the things that people can think through about whether or not it's going to be useful for them.
Awesome. So shift gears here real quick. So Amira, for her, talk to me about the practice. What, like how large is your practice? And then how long have you had this practice? What caused you to, have you always been entrepreneurial in your being, and this is just an expression of that? Or is this something that's like, at some point this switched over and then this is just something you had to get out of you?
Yeah. So it's really interesting. Well, at least it's interesting to me, Tom. So I worked in administration, right? Like, I did clinical work early on in my career, and I really focused on administration. I liked leading and helping people to reach goals and seeing programs thrive and families thrive and all this sort of stuff, right? And my heart was really in working individually with people. So I would get some of that, satisfaction from working with a therapist that I was supervising, or that sort of thing, like that one-on-one interaction, to be able to help them to reach their goals. But I really also wanted to make a difference for my community, right? And I knew my experiences going to therapy were not so great, right? And I knew I wanted to create that space. I never thought we have 50 therapists at this point. I never thought I'd have 50 therapists working in my practice, but, I said, let me give it a shot. I started on Saturdays. Seeing 4 clients was my goal. I started with 1 client, and it really just grew from there. But I do want to say that like the transitioning for me, right? So I see a client here and there. I do a workshop here and there, that sort of thing. 2011, when I first started, right? Like it was very, very small and beyond words manageable. Like I'd have the rest of my Saturday to do what I wanted with. Sometimes I'd have 2 hours in my practice out of the whole week, right? And this is where it gets a little funny, right? So 2013 comes, I meet the person that I marry and later divorce and who I end up abused by. And he wanted to open up a restaurant, right? So I helped him open up this restaurant. I came up with, 20 grand plus. I found ways to get money to pay for all these different things. I really hustled in a way that I had never done that before to make sure that I was working enough and doing enough to be able to support this person in their dream. And, one of the things that it taught me was how capable an entrepreneur I really was. I had no idea that I could handle like the number of things that I handled just being, connected to this person in this way and having so much responsibility for what was technically their business. So towards the end of it, I was just like, you know what? I really have the capacity to do a lot more on my own. And I was feeling a lot more confident about it. And I expanded and expanded and expanded and expanded. And that's how I ended up having the group practice.
So literally one of the darkest points of your adult life, what you brought out of yourself in that period of time birthed the awareness that you have this particular drive and the ability to be an entrepreneur. And then all of a sudden that was combined with this, you already knew that about yourself, that you were someone who facilitated people's healings. And that was something that was very powerful to you. But then you had this administrative work as well, and then learn this thing about yourself over here. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, just like all those confluence of it's like the confluence of rivers. It creates a larger river. It sounds like that's really, really amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely.
So, was it like courageous? Like, did you have to invoke like courage as you transitioned this, or was this an easy kind of transition from the administrator into full-time entrepreneur?
Yeah, I definitely had to be courageous, right? Like, I kind of feel like being part of a marginalized population is like, for me and what I was taught by my parents and grandparents was like, you always make sure you have enough, right? Like no matter what happens, you make sure you're safe and that you have enough. So not knowing what you're going to bring in every 2 weeks, right? Like, or every week, not knowing for sure that you have vacation time or sick time, having to figure out how you're going to navigate health insurance. All of these things I had to let go of and had to think through and figure out. So it was like a lot of honestly like praying, a lot of like talking to my mom and being like, do you think I can do this? And at one point she's like, Amira, like how much are you bringing in per client and how many hours are you doing? And can you get more clients if you want them? So I think I probably took like about 6 months of seeing almost a full-time practice before I completely transitioned over, right? So I would work all day Saturday, all day Sunday, and see clients, a couple of evenings during the week so that I knew for sure, look, all this time I've been bringing in this amount of money. If I stop my day job now, I'll still be bringing in at least this and probably more because I'll actually have more hours to do. And this is how I can get health insurance. And this is how I can plan for my retirement. And this is how I can, create a savings. So it wasn't an easy step for me. It was something that really took a lot of like reassurance and like, trying and seeing and knowing only because I had done it, for me to be able to actually like step into it and do it.
So you mentioned African-American community marginalization, that historically occurred over a period of time. And then essentially we live in a set of conditions that are, for lack of, perfect analogy, it's a set of conditions that are created by long-term kind of issues, policies, practices, either overt or very subtle, right? So you talked about the marginalization and that there's within the African American community, like I think you mentioned earlier, it was your responsibility to break generational like cycles. I may be getting the words wrong on that. And then you just kind of mentioned it again with respect to, to your parents, teaching you, to be safe, make sure you have enough, be safe, make sure you have enough. Is that a cultural thing, like a very steeped in the African American culture of this idea of seek for safety, make sure you have enough? Is that just geo specific to, let's say, the East Coast? What's your experience on that?
Yeah, my experience is it's definitely a cultural thing. Absolutely. And I've joked with some of my clients, we talk about it, and my clients who have come to me, some of who are men or women of color who want to go and start their own business, right? And it's kind of like, my family told me I should get a city job. Like, we're always looking for like the city job or the state job, because then no matter how racist somebody is or how much they hate you, they can't get rid of you that easy, right? So it's like always looking for safety, always making sure that you're going to be safe, that you're going to be able to pay what needs to be paid, and that you're going to be okay. So it's definitely been my experience that it's definitely a cultural phenomenon, like all over the US at the very least.
Got it. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm not able to have the perspective that you have. However, the perspective I do have is that the position that you have, the incredible practice that you've built as an entrepreneurial Black female, is something that is not something that I'm used to seeing in mass. You know what I mean? And so within the scope of that, I can say, oh, that's fascinating, that my experience of life tells me that there's something that this feels and appears unique in a different way. So, I try to abstain from having very specific opinions, because I'm not qualified. But what you're describing, what you're talking about, it's like, it kind of feels like puzzle pieces, like a little bit, that, yeah, it seems like it would make a lot of sense if, for a marginalized group to seek for safety, to train, to raise their children to seek for safety, and that then influences, consciously or unconsciously, the decisions that they make around what they're willing to risk from an entrepreneurial aspect. And so I wonder, we're off topic. However, I wonder, it's like how many other business owners are there, that might, but for kind of like a cultural bias towards safety, lock themselves, within the four walls of their mind, and they're not taking the risk that then is part of, what can propel, generational change and wealth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So,
sure.
Thanks for kind of shining a light and help me to rabbit hole. Is there anything that you heard in my interpretation, that is, that you're like, hey, that's not quite, it's more like, or is that a reasonable?
No, that's completely reasonable. Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Cool. So you go through your process. Were you a lone wolf in what you were doing, or were you leaning on like a support structure of other psychotherapists or entrepreneurs or family units? You mentioned your mom was kind of like in your back pocket,
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like giving you sage entrepreneurial advice. Well, can you make it work? Can you not make it work? But were you a lone wolf, or did you tap into support groups, and what did that look like?
Yeah. So unfortunately, I was a lone wolf with a lot of it, right? There was a woman I had met at a meeting once who had her own private practice. She was a Black woman. And I was just like, okay, we're going to stay connected. But she was so busy with her stuff that we didn't get that much time to connect. But she was some help to me. And then the other part of it was creating a peer supervision group, right? So myself and another woman, Raquel, we were like, you know what, we're doing this. And she's also a Black woman entrepreneur and a therapist. And so we decided to start a peer supervision group together, and we invited some other therapists. So it's, it's kind of funny. It's like 2 Blacks and 2 Jews, and we have a peer supervision group.
That's awesome. Well, you're in New York City. It's a good spot for them.
Exactly.
So you literally wrote the book on PTSD, or you wrote a book on PTSD. What's PTSD, to you in your world, or clinically, or are those two things the same, or are they different?
Yeah, yeah. So no, they are the same, right? So post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's really about what happens to us, what happens to a person's brain and the way that they function and the way that certain things get trapped in their mind and in their emotions and even in their bodies that prevent them from growing past or recovering from like the traumatic event that they experience or events that they experience. And it has a huge impact and people don't always like understand or think about it. There are so many ways that people can be traumatized, unfortunately, right? Like we think about combat veterans, we think about, certain types of assault or a car accident, but we don't think about some of the other things, right? We don't think about the student who gets punched in his face by a peer at school, right? Like we don't think about lots of other things. Like literally PTSD can be caused any time that a person feels like their physical body is at risk and or their psyche is at risk. Like when it feels like they're at risk of annihilation or serious harm, that can cause trauma. So trauma is caused by all sorts of things. And then people respond and react to trauma in all sorts of different ways. And what can happen is that your mind starts to like automatically go to the trauma, right? And respond like you're being traumatized all over again, respond like fight, flight, right? Like over small things. So that's where you see a lot of kids with like lots of behavioral problems, acting out. You see lots of violence that, all over the place. A lot of people are struggling with trauma and aren't aware of it, don't have the language for it.
Awesome. And you said in your own process that EMDR as a treatment was something that was deeply helpful for you. And would you mind kind of explaining just a little bit of EMDR?
Absolutely. So it's the eye movement desensitization. I want to say rapidization. I think that's what the R is. But basically, it's like learning how to reprogram your brain and your thinking with using your eyes, with using sensory. So there's a really long, I think it's like a 2-year training that the therapists have to go through to become EMDR certified. And it starts off just like regular trauma therapy, right? Like starts off with like helping you to think, well, first of all, to identify like the things that will make you feel safe if you start to feel unsafe, right? Like what can you do to provide yourself with safety in that moment, right? And then it goes into like creating your trauma narrative. So what happened, piecing together the story, trying to remember all the parts of the story. As a trauma survivor myself, there are still parts of my story that I don't remember. Or like, I'll be like, yeah, this happened. And I don't know if that was tomorrow or like 5 minutes later. And that's normal. That's like part of the way that your mind responds to trauma because your mind wants to keep you safe and doesn't want to expose you to that feeling of like, you could be annihilated at any moment. So creating the trauma narrative, that's the second part of it, just like with all trauma therapy. And then with EMDR, there's a lot more assessment and a lot more focus on like your feeling state in the moment when you're thinking about specific parts of the trauma that are really difficult. And that's where you do the eye movement with the therapist who like will show you like, okay, go like this, 4 times. And I want you to think about, and I want you to talk to me about that time. And it helps to rewire your brain. That's the idea and the theory behind it. I found it incredibly helpful for me. I had started with another therapist prior and, she was stuck and I was stuck and she was like, you need an EMDR therapist. Like you need to get out of here. We're not going anywhere. You're not getting better. So that's how I ended up with the EMDR therapist who was life-changing, really life-changing for me. And I don't know if I would be able to function, back where I am now had I not had that experience. So it was amazing. And I'm forever grateful for that.
I think sometimes, culturally speaking, we get into like this place of it's this, therefore none of that, right? It's like one way and then everything else is kind of like invalid. And I think trauma specifically, it exists in multiple realms that people deal with. And so whereas, like in a talk therapy setting, there is like, it's important in certain ways. However, it's like a key that doesn't fit the door to necessarily get into some of these other things that other modalities, such as an EMDR, as one, for example, can kind of access. And it's kind of like not one thing. It's like healing might be one thing. Maybe it might be 2 things. It might be 5 things to eventually kind of like round the corner. And the thing that I've just felt very strongly in when I first looking to connect with you, it was like, you feel like you feel like healing is it's like you're a coach for it with respect to it's like, oh yeah, this is what we're doing. And there's probably a little bit of this, and maybe like, and you have I'm babbling and I apologize. However,
no, I hear you.
And so if you wouldn't mind, as we kind of, we got, a little bit more time, and are you still okay on time right now?
Yeah, I'm okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. One of my favorite books in the entire world is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. It's just that you read that one?
I haven't read it, but I think I've heard of it.
It's an extraordinary account of his time in a concentration camp, and the what he endured and why he surmises that he survived and others didn't. And it's called Man's Search for Meaning. And you talked very specifically about meaning making being this incredible, part of what your recovery was. And I suspect there's a big component of it that's a part of your practice. Would you discuss a little bit about what your process of meaning making is?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So meaning making is really about like finding some sort of a meaning in the trauma, right? Or in the traumatic events that you've experienced. So, and this is, this was really hard for me because it's kind of like you have to think about, finding the positive thing that you got out of this experience, or the learning that you may have done, or the new insight that you may have now, or even the new ways that you're going to keep yourself safe now, right? Like, you have to find some sort of a meaning in order to help you to heal from the trauma, right? And I was just like, this is horrible. Like, there's no meaning around this. This is awful. Like, no way. But for me, one of the things that I did that was really incredibly helpful was writing my book, right? Like,
which one? Because you are prolific and you have many books.
Thank you. Healing from an Abusive Relationship, Life After the Breakup. Right. So in this one, really focusing on like what some of the characteristics and the traits of people who do antisocial personality disordered abuse, which looks very different from like typical domestic violence that we think of. How do they look? How can we identify them? What can we think about to keep ourselves safe? And who are they looking for? Right? Like, who are their ideal victims? And for people to look at that and to be able to read that and to understand, am I this person? And am I being taken advantage of in some specific way? Or how do I need to guard myself because I know I am this person, right? Like, a lot of the traits for the ideal victim are like being really empathic, or really like working really hard, being really conscientious, being committed to relationships, like a really strong commitment to the relationships that are important to you. Sandra Brown had identified these 15 traits that, can't remember the exact number, but traits that these people who are abused by, people with antisocial personality disorder have. So I fit that bill, right? Like, I 100% fit that bill. But for me, the meaning making was really like, how can I help other people keep this from happening to them? How can I help spread the awareness and the education about this? And that gave me so much meaning making, right? Like, that is my meaning making. The fact that I was able to put something down on paper to help other people avoid this and or recover from it means the world to me. And I like to think that that's part of why this experience happened to me.
Yeah. So there's something subtle that as you kind of like talk through that process that's occurring, is like, what for it to mean something, there was a process of giving up something that had to be. And I think that's the most complicated component for anybody who's going to choose to make it mean a positive in their life. Like, what did you have to give up in order for it to mean ultimately what it's meant in your life at this point?
I think I had to give up feeling completely, honestly, this is weird, but feeling powerless, annihilated, and wronged, right? Yeah. Like, I had to let go of feeling those things, of feeling powerless, annihilated, and wronged. And I had to take a couple things. One is some sense of ownership around this horrific, life-changing experience, and look at my role. But then I also had to, think about how I can use this and use myself as a vehicle to be able to help other people to heal from. So giving up that complete sense of defeat, I think I had to let go of that.
Yeah, no, I think it's perfectly said. It's such a complicated intellectual set of gymnastics. However,
Yeah.
it's like true that the only empowering context is to give yourself full agency over what occurred. Doesn't mean you did it, however, in giving yourself agency that says like this was my responsibility, then you then give yourself agency to make it mean whatever it means, which then loosens the grip on the power that it had. And like that's such a like world shifting kind of perspective for people to take on. And it's so hard because like, of course, like it's not fair. And of course it shouldn't have happened, and of course all of these things. And yet at the end of that tube, you're left with powerlessness, which doesn't do anybody any good. I just think it's amazing. And I think you pointed to it brilliantly, just that subtle thing that has to be left behind to put it in the context that makes it mean everything. And look at the lives that you're changing as a result of what you became in that entire process. I think it's just absolutely beautiful. As much as I think it'd be great if it never happened to you, like pixie dust. However, here we are. So let's take all the amazing.
Thank you, Tom.
So if you were going to share something with someone who's like listening, maybe longing to take a risk or begin to heal in some particular capacity, to really just, they want to feel like themselves, again, however, like they're afraid of whatever the first step or whatever it is, like what do you want to share with somebody?
Yeah, I just would want to say a couple things. One is like, when you're really stuck and you feel like something's completely impossible and you feel like, just that series of no's and you can'ts in your head. If it's a way that you want to feel, try to think of a time that you felt that way before and what was different in your life then. And can you take one step to shift so that you can start to be on the path towards feeling that way again, right? Like if you're completely socially isolated and you're depressed and alone, maybe it was, when you had friends and you had, lunch with someone was the last time that you can really think of feeling fulfilled. Take one step towards that, whether it's like making a phone call to someone from your past, contacting a friend, a sibling, even getting on like meetup.com or one of those social spaces where you can start to connect with people. Take one small step towards it. And, every single thing that you do, I really believe this, like every action that you take in life is going to have some sort of an effect, right? Like it's not likely that what you're going to do is going to have no effect. It might not get you where you want to be, but it's going to have some sort of an effect, some sort of a step to bring you closer to what it is that you want. And for the people who are afraid and want to kind of like step out of that box and do something else, it's kind of similar, except for like, you're not necessarily thinking about what you've had, but you're picturing the vision, envisioning it, and you're thinking about what that would feel like, how that would experience would be for you. What would it change about your life and your circumstances if you were able to actually do that thing that you want to do, and really create that vision for yourself. And then you can begin to think, work backwards and think, well, what are the steps that I actually need to be able to get there, and slowly chip away at them. I mean, I started my practice in my basement, literally like had a carpenter come and throw up some sheetrock. And that's where I started my practice. And now we're, 50 therapists in and serving all over New York State and also some other places and doing workshops. And like, I started all that in my basement as a single mom, So, just having the vision of what you want will take you places.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for sharing yourself with us here. How can we reach you, Amira?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple different ways. My website, Amira, Amira, 4FOR, her.com, or you can even email me at amiramartinlcsw@gmail.com.
Awesome. Thank you so very, very much for spending time with us. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing your incredible insights, and look forward to keeping in touch here in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
All right, this has been another episode of the Intentional Soul Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. Remember to leave a 5-star review if you found this content of value. And as always, I'm your host, Tom Ross, master practitioner of the Advanced Rapid Enlightenment Process and Rapid Enlightenment Process developed by Matthew Ferry. You can reach me at tom@tomrosstalks.com, and the website to engage and be a part of any classes, trainings, or sessions I have going on is www.tomrosstalks.com. Until next time, peace.